Have you ever walked into a room so beautifully decorated that every corner seemed to glow, yet still felt like something was missing, like the air itself carried a silence only you could hear? That was my wedding day. From the outside, it looked perfect. Rows of white chairs draped with ribbons, roses spilling from tall vases, candles flickering even in the daylight as though the world itself wanted to honor me. Friends whispered excitedly, cousins snapped photos, children tugged on their parents' hands with squeals of delight. But in the front row, 2 chairs stood empty, their absence louder than any organ music. They were supposed to hold my parents. I had tried to convince myself in the weeks leading up to the ceremony that they might come. I replayed every possible version of their arrival, my mother clutching her purse, my father adjusting his tie, both pretending as though nothing had ever been said. But deep down I knew they had dismissed my wedding as trivial, a word that still burned in my ears, telling me I was beneath their attention. It wasn't new. My life had always been measured against my brother's successes, my efforts brushed aside like dust. But a part of me still held on to a child's hope. That morning, the hotel suite was alive with the hum of preparation. The scent of hairspray lingered thick in the air. My bridesmaids sprawled across the couches, curling irons hissing, laughter spilling between sips of coffee. "You're glowing," one of them teased, snapping a candid picture. I smiled, but behind the grin my chest felt tight. As they argued playfully about mascara shades, my eyes drifted toward my phone, sitting silent on the counter. No calls, no messages. Not even a curt, "good luck." When the makeup artist leaned close, brushing foundation across my skin, she whispered, "Nervous?" I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that hides tears. "Something like that," I said. But what I wanted to confess was that I wasn't nervous about the vows or the kiss or the future. I was nervous about those empty chairs, already haunting me before I even stepped outside. The ride to the church blurred in flashes, the squeal of tires on wet pavement, the bouquet trembling in my hands, the bridesmaids chattering in the back. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the car window, staring out at strangers who didn't know that inside this dress was a daughter waiting for parents who had already abandoned her. My driver hummed along to the radio, oblivious. It struck me then how the world goes on, indifferent to your deepest wounds. When I arrived, the air smelled of polished wood and lilies. The organ played softly as guests found their seats. I stayed hidden in the bridal room, peeking through a small crack in the door. My groom stood at the altar, tall and anxious, adjusting his cufflinks every few seconds. His mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and there, in the front row, were the chairs. 2 glaring absences decorated just as carefully as all the others, ribbons tied neatly, waiting for people who would never arrive. A bridesmaid squeezed my hand. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded, swallowing hard. The music swelled. I stepped out, every camera flashing, every eye on me. For a moment, it felt like magic. But then I glanced at the front row. Empty. My chest hollowed. I forced my smile wider, clinging to the sight of my groom's tearful grin, but the hollowness followed me step by step down the aisle. When I reached him, he whispered, "You look incredible." His voice steadied me for a heartbeat. The priest began to speak, words about love, devotion, and unity. I tried to focus, but the rhythm of his voice became a drumbeat for my pain. "They're not here. They're not here." I slipped the ring onto his finger with hands that trembled, not from nerves, but from the crushing weight of rejection. After the ceremony, as applause filled the church, I caught snippets of whispers. "Where are her parents?" someone murmured. "Did they really not come?" another whispered back. I held my bouquet tighter, pretending not to hear, but the whispers clung to me like smoke. Even in joy, I was marked by absence. The reception was a blur of music and laughter. Glasses clinked, waiters carried trays of champagne, children danced near the stage. My friends tried to shield me with endless chatter, telling jokes, spinning me onto the dance floor. But each time I returned to my seat, those whispers returned too. Maybe they'll show up late. Maybe something happened. I nodded politely, but I knew better. Their absence wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, a statement. And the statement was clear. You are not worth our time. Later, my new husband found me staring at the door. "Still hoping?" he asked gently. I bit my lip, then shook my head. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted. He pulled me close, his embrace warm, but it couldn't fill the void of parents who had chosen to wound me in the most public way possible. When the night ended, I slipped away into the hotel room still wearing my dress. The sequins scratched against my skin as I sank into a chair, staring at my reflection. Mascara streaked down my cheeks, hairpins loosened, bouquet wilting in my lap. I looked less like a bride and more like a ghost of one. "How did it come to this?" I whispered to the empty room. "How did love turn into absence?" The silence answered me back. That night, something hardened inside me. For years, I had accepted their cruelty as inevitability, but sitting there, I felt anger surge hotter than grief. It burned away the last fragile threads of hope. If they could ignore my wedding, the day meant to bind families together, then maybe I had to let go of the fantasy that they would ever choose me. Maybe family was not about blood, but about who shows up. Who claps when you walk down the aisle? Who holds you steady when you stumble? That thought terrified me, but it also freed me. I didn't erase the ache, but I planted a seed, and as I drifted to sleep, still in that heavy dress, I realized that sometimes empty chairs teach you more about love than full ones ever could. The morning after the wedding, sunlight poured into the hotel room like it had no idea what had happened the night before. The dress was still draped across the chair, wrinkled and heavy, a silent reminder of the vows I'd spoken and the absences I couldn't erase. My husband was asleep, his breathing steady, his arm curled protectively across the sheets. I wanted to reach for him, to anchor myself in the comfort of new love, but instead I stared at the ceiling and felt the echo of those empty chairs throb in my chest. Have you ever woken up after a big moment and realized the joy is tangled with grief? That was me. I wanted to replay the laughter, the dancing, the promises we made. But the memory of whispers at the reception, the sideways glances, the pity in people's eyes, they overshadowed everything else. My phone sat on the nightstand, still silent. No message, no explanation. Just the same rejection written in digital silence. We went to brunch with friends who tried too hard to fill the gap. "You two looked amazing yesterday," one said, flipping through photos on her phone. "That kiss at the altar? Straight out of a movie." I smiled politely, nodding at the screen, but my mind kept circling back to the missing faces. Every toast, every joke, felt like it floated above a pit no one wanted to acknowledge. On the ride home, the city blurred by in streaks of gray and green. My husband reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to say it," he murmured. "I know." But did he? Could anyone really know what it feels like to have your own parents turn their backs on the most important day of your life? I squeezed back, grateful but hollow. That week was supposed to be filled with honeymoon bliss, but instead I found myself drifting between moments of laughter and sudden waves of anger. We went for walks, shared ice cream, watched sunsets. Yet every time I saw a family walking together, a mom adjusting her child's hat, a dad snapping pictures, I felt the sting again. It was like carrying an invisible bruise that flared whenever I least expected it. One evening, as we sat by the water, my husband asked, Do you want to confront them? The word confront hung between us like a challenge. Part of me wanted to scream at them, demand answers, force them to look me in the eye. But another part of me was terrified. What if their answer was simple? What if it was just, we didn't care? Could I survive hearing that said aloud? Days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched longer. I tried distracting myself with work, with friends, with the rhythm of daily life. But each time my phone buzzed, I hoped. And each time it wasn't them, the hope shriveled a little more. People talk about cutting ties like it's a clean break. It's not. It's a slow unraveling, threads snapping one by one until you're left staring at the frayed ends of what used to be family. Then came the turning point. I was unpacking wedding gifts, tearing through ribbons and boxes, when I found an envelope with my parents' handwriting. My breath caught. Could it be an apology? A late attempt to make things right? With shaking hands, I tore it open. Inside was a single card. Congratulations. We hope you build something worthwhile, even if it's small. The words cut deeper than their silence. Not only had they chosen not to come, but they reduced my marriage to something small, something beneath their notice. My hands trembled. The card slipped from my fingers onto the floor. I felt heat rise in my chest, a roaring in my ears. My husband rushed in at the sound of the paper falling. He picked it up, read it, and his face darkened. "You don't have to keep this," he said, his voice sharp with anger. I looked at him, then at the card, and whispered, "But it's all I have from them." That admission broke something in me. I realized I had been holding on to scraps, begging for crumbs of love, when what I deserved was a seat at the table, a cheer from the front row, a hug on the biggest day of my life. That night I cried harder than I had in years. My husband sat with me saying nothing, just holding me while I unraveled. Between sobs, I asked, "Why am I still hoping? Why can't I just let go?" He kissed the top of my head and said, "Because you're human. Because you care, even when they don't." His words didn't fix the wound, but they reminded me I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a quiet resolve. Maybe I couldn't control their choices, but I could control mine. I started writing. At first, it was just scribbles in a notebook, fragments of pain, flashes of memory, questions with no answers. But as the pages filled, I felt lighter. The anger still flared. The sadness still pressed in, but I had a place to put it. My story wasn't just about rejection, it was about survival. Weeks later, I stood in front of a mirror, notebook in hand, and read aloud what I had written. My voice shook at first, but then it grew stronger. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't begging for their love. I was reclaiming my own worth. And in that moment, I realized something vital. Their absence was no longer the loudest part of my story. My voice was. The notebook had become my late-night companion. I filled it with half-finished sentences, questions I knew would never be answered, and memories that still stung like fresh cuts. But writing wasn't enough anymore. The silence from my parents had stretched too long, and every page I scribbled only made me realize how much I needed to hear something, anything from them. So one evening, I did something reckless. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number. The ring felt endless. When she finally answered, her voice was flat, like I was a stranger. "Hello?" she said. My breath caught. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I forced the words out. "It's me." I needed to ask why. There was a pause, and I imagined her frowning, tapping her nails against the counter the way she always did when she was annoyed. "Why what?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "Why didn't you come? Why wasn't my wedding worth your time?" Her sigh was heavy, dismissive. "We told you before. We don't celebrate trivial events. Your brother's career, his promotions, those are milestones. What you did? It's nothing compared to that." The words slammed into me harder than I expected. I wanted to shout, to beg, to plead. Instead, I whispered, "I'm your daughter." "Yes," she replied coldly, "and sometimes children have to understand their place." My hand shook as I hung up. My husband found me sitting on the floor, the phone still buzzing against the wood. He crouched down, cupping my face. "What happened?" he asked, eyes wide with worry. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, tears spilling, my chest heaving with the weight of rejection spelled out so clearly it burned. For days after that call, the anger inside me grew. I replayed her words again and again, each time sharper, crueler. My coworkers noticed my distraction. My friends offered sympathy, but their comfort only skimmed the surface. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if family was just another illusion I had been foolish enough to believe in. Then came the twist I never expected. A week later, I received a letter, not from my parents, but from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Inside was a message that shattered the little stability I had left. They told everyone you married beneath you, that you chose a small life. They said they couldn't support something so beneath the family name. I read it out loud, my hands trembling, while my husband paced the room, his jaw tightened. "So this isn't just about them not showing up. They're trying to shame you publicly." That realization was like ice water down my spine. Their absence wasn't silent anymore. It was an announcement, a performance, a declaration meant to strip me of dignity in front of the whole family. My husband grabbed my hands. "Then we show them. We build a life so full, so rich, they choke on their own bitterness." But in that moment, I didn't feel strong. I felt small, like a child again, standing in the shadow of parents who measured worth only by trophies and titles. I whispered, "What if they're right? What if I'll never be enough?" He pulled me close, his voice fierce. "They're wrong, and one day you'll see it too." That night, as I stared out the window at the city lights, something shifted inside me. Their cruelty was no longer just a wound. It was a challenge. And though I wasn't ready to face it yet, the seed of defiance had been planted. I started avoiding family gatherings, even the ones I used to enjoy. Every invitation felt like a trap. Every phone call a reminder that their voices could cut me down in a single sentence. Friends told me to ignore it, to live my life without their approval. Easy words, hard practice. Because no matter how far I tried to run, my parents' shadow stretched long, reaching into corners I thought were safe. One evening, I sat across from my husband at our tiny kitchen table. Dinner was getting cold, untouched. He leaned forward, searching my face. "You're somewhere else again," he said softly. I can't stop hearing her voice, I admitted. The way she said it, like I'm nothing. Like love means nothing. He sighed, pushing his plate away. "Then maybe it's time you stop waiting for them to change. Maybe it's time you change the story instead." That sentence clung to me. Change the story. But how do you rewrite a narrative that's been etched into your bones since childhood? The answer came in pieces. A coworker invited me to a book club. At first I laughed it off, too weighed down to imagine small talk. But something nudged me to go. That night, surrounded by strangers who shared stories, who laughed loudly, who welcomed me without hesitation, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. On the walk home, I realized that family might not always be blood. Sometimes it's the people who see you when others refuse to. That thought scared me. It felt like betrayal, but it also offered relief. The next week, I told my cousin who had written me the letter that I was done playing small. "If they think my life is beneath them," I said, "then maybe that's where I'll find freedom. Beneath their expectations." Her reply was quiet but firm. "Then live big in your own way. They'll choke on it." That night I returned to my notebook. But this time, I didn't just write questions. I wrote declarations, lines like, "I am worthy of love. I am not defined by absence. My story is mine to tell." My handwriting shook, but the words felt like anchors pulling me back into myself. The silence from my parents didn't stop hurting. It may never stop. But as I closed the notebook and looked around at the home my husband and I were building, humble, imperfect, but ours, I realized the midpoint of my pain wasn't the end. It was the turn. The moment the story stopped being about them and started being about me. The first time I said it out loud, my voice shook. "I can't keep waiting for them." The words felt foreign, almost like I was betraying some unspoken rule. My husband looked at me across the living room, the glow from the lamp softening the lines of his face. He didn't rush to respond. He just nodded, as if he had been waiting for me to get here on my own. That night, I lay in bed replaying my mother's words. Children have to understand their place. For weeks, those words had haunted me, pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake. But now in the dark, I found myself whispering back, "My place is not where you left me." The next morning, I made a small change. I deleted her number from my favorites. It was symbolic, yes, but it mattered. It meant I wasn't going to keep staring at the phone, waiting for a call that would never come. From there, it was a series of tiny boundaries. I stopped checking social media for updates about my brother's achievements. I muted family group chats where their praise echoed endlessly while my name was never mentioned. Each click, each silence felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But setting boundaries isn't a clean process. One afternoon, my aunt called unexpectedly. Her voice was warm, but beneath it I heard the familiar undertone of judgment. "We missed you at the last dinner," she said. "Your parents looked so proud of your brother. Maybe if you reached out more, things would be different." The words stung, but I steadied my voice. "Maybe," I replied, "but I'm not going to beg for a seat at the table anymore." The silence that followed told me she wasn't expecting that. When she finally muttered, "Well, it's your choice," I realized how powerful those words were. My choice. I started noticing how much space I had given to people who refused to see me. My journals were filled with their names, my sleepless nights tangled in their absence. But slowly, I began replacing that space with something else. With long walks by the river, with cooking new recipes alongside my husband, laughing when we burned the sauce, with reading books that reminded me life could be bigger than the narrow cage of my parents' approval. One evening, I sat with my husband on the balcony as the city lights flickered on below us. "Do you think they'll ever change?" I asked. He took a long breath before answering. "Maybe. But that's not the point, is it? The point is, you already are." That struck me. Change wasn't waiting on them anymore. Change was happening inside me, with every choice to step away from their shadow. Still, there were setbacks. Some nights, loneliness crept in like an old friend. I'd find myself reaching for my phone, half hoping for a message that never came. But then I'd open my notebook and remind myself of the words I'd written. I am not defined by absence. Reading them aloud became a ritual, like building a wall brick by brick. The biggest test came during Thanksgiving. My brother sent out a family-wide invitation to his new house. Photos of the spread, the decorations, the smiling faces filled my feed. For the first time, I didn't cry. Instead, I turned off my phone, set the table in our own home, and invited friends who had nowhere else to go. The laughter around that table was louder, freer, more genuine than anything I remembered from childhood dinners. That night, as dishes piled in the sink and candles burned low, one of my friends squeezed my hand and said, "You built this. You created this space." And I realized she was right. I wasn't waiting for love to be handed down from above anymore. I was planting it here, in my own soil. Little by little, the boundaries I drew stopped feeling like walls and started feeling like doors. Doors I could close to keep out cruelty and open to welcome in people who saw me, truly saw me. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a daughter abandoned. I felt like a woman becoming. It started with a knock on the door I wasn't expecting. A cousin again, holding an envelope with my name scrawled in my father's handwriting. My hand shook as I took it. For weeks, I had been telling myself I was done waiting, done hoping, but here it was, ink on paper, their voice reaching into my home. I sat at the kitchen table, the light flickering above me, and tore it open. The words were sharp, clipped. "We heard what you've been saying. If you want respect, you must earn it. Stop embarrassing us with your choices." I read it twice, then 3 times, my heart hammering louder with every line. This wasn't an apology. It was another command, another attempt to pull me back into their shadow. My husband leaned over my shoulder, scanning the page. "They're not reaching out," he said flatly. "They're pulling you back under." I clenched the letter in my fist. For the first time, anger burned hotter than grief. Then maybe it's time I stop whispering my story in notebooks. Maybe it's time I speak where they can hear me. That decision carried me into the next week. I drafted a letter of my own. Pages and pages spilled out, words I had swallowed for years. Memories of being compared to my brother. The sting of being told my dreams were small. The pain of seeing my parents celebrate everyone else while leaving me invisible. I didn't send it to them, not yet. Instead, I read it aloud at the book club, my voice trembling at first, then steadying as faces around me nodded, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time, I felt heard, not because they were my family, but because they were willing to see me. That night, my phone lit up with messages from those friends. "You're brave. Your story matters. Don't stop speaking." Their words patched holes I didn't know I still carried. But the real confrontation came later, when I saw my parents at a relative's anniversary party. I hadn't planned it. I walked in, and there they were. My mother in a silver dress, my father with his usual stern face. The room buzzed with chatter, music spilling from the speakers, but the air between us was electric. She saw me first. Her lips pressed thin. My father turned away, as if ignoring me would erase me. But I wasn't the same daughter who had begged for a seat at their table. I walked up, every step a declaration. "Hello," I said simply. My mother's eyes flicked over me, then to my husband at my side. "We didn't expect you here." I held her gaze. "I didn't come for you." "I came because this is family too, and I have as much right to be here as anyone." Her face tightened. "You've been speaking ill of us." "Do you think respect is earned that way?" The room seemed to quiet around us, whispers curling through the air. My chest rose and fell, but my voice didn't shake. "Respect isn't earned by abandoning your child. Respect isn't built on silence and shame. You want me small. I won't be small anymore." My father finally looked at me, his jaw set. "You'll regret this tone." I took a breath, feeling years of weight lift as I said, "Maybe, but I regret every year I stayed silent more." The music kicked back in, the chatter resumed, but something fundamental had shifted. They turned away, retreating into their circle, but I didn't crumble. I stood taller, surrounded by relatives who now looked at me differently, not as the forgotten daughter, but as someone who refused to stay invisible. Later, outside under the night sky, my husband squeezed my hand. "You drew the line," he said. I exhaled, the cool air filling my lungs. "And I'm never stepping back." I didn't leave right away. Something told me to stay, to breathe through the discomfort. My hands trembled as I picked up a glass of water, but I kept moving through the crowd. An older cousin stopped me near the buffet table. "You were brave," she whispered, glancing toward where my parents stood stiffly in the corner. "No one ever says those things out loud." I swallowed hard. I wasn't trying to start a scene. Sometimes a scene is what it takes, she replied. Then softer, we all saw how they treated you. Some of us just didn't know what to say. Her words warmed something deep in me. For so long, I had believed silence meant agreement, that everyone saw me as lesser. But maybe silence wasn't always agreement. Sometimes it was fear. Another relative, an uncle who rarely spoke to me, clapped me on the shoulder. "Took guts," he muttered, before moving on. It wasn't much, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd had in years. As the evening wore on, I caught glimpses of my parents avoiding my gaze. My brother arrived late, his arm around his fiancée, their laughter filling the room. He noticed the tension, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Maybe he didn't know what to say either. I stepped outside for air, the music muffled behind me. The night was cool, the stars scattered across the sky. My husband joined me, silent for a while, just letting me breathe. Then he asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought about that, about the way my mother's face had tightened, the warning in my father's voice, about the whispers, the stares, the line I had finally drawn. And then I shook my head. No, for the first time, I don't regret speaking. He smiled, pulling me close. Then that's the beginning, not the end. Driving home later, the letter still crumpled in my bag, I realized the confrontation wasn't about winning them over. It wasn't about making them love me. It was about proving to myself that I could stand tall, even when their eyes tried to shrink me. Back in our apartment, I lit a candle and opened my notebook again. This time, I didn't write questions. I didn't even write about them. I wrote about me, about the woman who had walked into a room full of judgment and refused to bow her head, about the daughter who was no longer defined by absence, but by courage. And as the candle flickered low, I knew. This was the story I would keep telling. Not the story of their rejection, but the story of my becoming. The morning after the confrontation, the sky outside our apartment looked washed clean. Clouds scattered like torn fabric, sunlight slipping through the cracks. I stood by the window with my coffee, listening to the hum of the city below, and for the first time in years, the silence in my chest felt different. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of finally putting something down. The letter still sat in my drawer, edges bent. Words burned into my memory, but it no longer dictated how I moved through the day. I thought I'd wake with regret, with the weight of their faces pressed against me. Instead, I felt space. Space I didn't know I had been craving. At work, people noticed. A colleague stopped me in the hallway. "You look lighter," she said. I laughed, surprised. "I guess I am." I didn't tell her about the confrontation, about the sharp words exchanged in a room full of relatives. But somehow, my body told the story without needing the details. That evening, I went to the market. The smell of fresh bread, the chatter of vendors, the clink of coins, it all felt sharper, more alive. I filled my bag with vegetables, bread, a small jar of honey, simple things. But walking home, I thought, this is the kind of life I want. Present, real, mine. Still, healing didn't arrive in a straight line. Nights were tricky. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my parents sat together dissecting what I had said. Did my name pass through their lips like a curse? Did my brother defend me, or did silence win again? The questions pressed in, and for a moment, I felt that old ache. One night, I whispered into the dark, what if they never change? What if they never give me the love I wanted? My husband rolled closer, his arm around me. His voice was steady, grounded. Then you'll stop needing it. And maybe that's the truest kind of freedom. I closed my eyes, letting his words sink into the cracks. Freedom didn't mean the longing disappeared. It meant I could live fully, even with longing still humming in the background. The book club became another anchor. I didn't always read my pages aloud. Sometimes I just listened. A woman told us about breaking ties with a friend who always belittled her. A man described moving states after his parents rejected him. Each story layered onto mine, weaving a fabric of resilience. I nodded until my neck ached, tears pricking my eyes. We weren't alone, any of us. At home, I started rituals that felt like small rebellions, lighting a candle at dinner, not for mourning, but for presence, cooking meals slowly, tasting each flavor, writing not desperate questions but steady truths. I am enough. My voice matters. I belong. On a Saturday night, I invited people over. Friends crowded around the tiny table, balancing plates on their knees when space ran out. The wine was cheap, the bread slightly burnt, but laughter rolled through the apartment like music. At one point, I leaned back, watching faces glow in the candlelight, and thought, this is family. Maybe not by blood, but by choice. And maybe that's even stronger. Later, when the guests had gone and dishes piled in the sink, I stood in the kitchen, exhausted but content. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. The echoes of laughter lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a blanket. The aftermath of confrontation wasn't dramatic. No reconciliations, no sudden phone calls begging me to return, but it was steady. It was quiet in a way that felt alive. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not fireworks, not grand apologies, but the whisper in your chest that says, you are still here. You are still worthy. And you are finally free to live as yourself. The weeks turned into months, and life began to stretch into a rhythm I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden transformation, but a quiet reshaping. I'd wake in the morning, sunlight spilling across the bed, and instead of dreading the silence from my parents, I felt grateful for the peace. I started walking to work instead of driving. The city looked different when you moved at the pace of your own feet. Coffee shops buzzed with chatter, dogs tugged on their leashes. Children carried backpacks almost too big for their bodies. I watched it all, and something inside me softened. Life was happening everywhere, and for once, I wasn't watching from the margins. But healing, I realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to carry memory without letting it poison you. There were still nights when I woke from dreams of my father's voice, sharp and cutting. I'd hear my mother's sigh, see her back turned away from me. Those moments still stung, like touching an old scar that hadn't fully faded. One evening, I lit a candle and opened my notebook. Instead of writing questions or affirmations, I wrote a letter I never planned to send. Dear Mom and Dad, I used to think your silence meant I wasn't worth loving. I carried that belief into every room, every friendship, every chance I had to be myself, but I was wrong. Your silence says more about your fears than my worth, and I can't carry that anymore. I hope one day you'll see me clearly, but even if you don't, I am no longer waiting. When I finished, I folded the page and tucked it into the back of the notebook. It wasn't for them. It was for me, to mark a line I had already crossed. Sundays became sacred in a new way. I used to dread family gatherings, the endless comparisons, the sideways comments. Now, Sundays were for chosen rituals. Sometimes my husband and I drove out of the city, chasing back roads until they ended in wide fields or riverbanks. Other times, we invited friends over, filling the apartment with mismatched chairs and conversations that tumbled over each other like waves. One Sunday evening, after everyone left, my husband leaned against the counter, drying dishes while I stacked them. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" "The idea of family." "The one you thought you had, quote." I paused, staring at the candle flickering low on the table. "Sometimes. But not in the way I used to. I miss what it could have been, not what it was. There's a difference." He nodded, sliding a glass into the cupboard. Maybe that's the first step of letting go, missing the dream, but not chasing it anymore. I smiled at him, realizing he was right. The grief wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It no longer pulled me backward. It reminded me of where I came from, but not where I was going. I also found myself reconnecting with my brother in small, tentative ways. A text on my birthday, a comment on a photo, nothing deep, nothing about the confrontation, but tiny threads. For the first time, I didn't demand more. I let the threads be what they were. If they grew, they grew. If not, I wouldn't unravel. Walking through the park one chilly afternoon, I noticed families everywhere. Kids shrieking on swings, parents jogging behind strollers. A pang hit me, the old longing for something whole and unquestioning. But then I remembered the last dinner with friends, the laughter so loud it spilled out the windows. Family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who showed up, who stayed, who chose you back. That night I whispered to myself before bed, I am not unloved, I am not alone, I am not a burden. And for the first time, the words didn't feel like lies. When the dust finally settled, I realized something strange. I wasn't standing in ruins. I was standing in a clearing. For years, I thought confrontation would leave me broken, stripped down to nothing. But instead, I felt like someone had finally cut away the vines that had been choking me. The clearing wasn't empty. It was wide and terrifying, but also full of possibility. I had space now, and space meant I could build. The first thing I did was change my mornings. It sounds simple, almost trivial, but for me, it was monumental. I stopped waking to the sound of dread. I bought a small alarm clock, the kind that ticked softly, and left my phone in another room. When the alarm rang, I opened the curtains before anything else. Some mornings were gray, some golden, but all of them were mine. I started walking to a nearby cafe instead of making coffee at home. Not because I needed caffeine, but because I needed ritual. The barista, a young guy with tattoos running down his arms, learned my name. "Good morning, Anna," he'd say, and those words meant more to me than I could admit. Someone saw me. Someone greeted me without judgment. At work, I stopped shrinking. For years, I had been afraid to speak up in meetings, terrified of sounding foolish. But one day, as I watched colleagues toss around ideas, I thought, what's the worst that can happen? Someone disagrees? I raised my hand, shared a thought, and the room didn't collapse. In fact, someone nodded, scribbling down my idea. That small victory planted something inside me. Confidence doesn't arrive as a flood. It seeps in, drip by drip, until you realize you're no longer thirsty. I also took up writing again. Not the desperate pleading letters to my parents that I used to hide under my pillow. This writing was different. I wrote essays about resilience, journal entries about the small beauties of each day, the scent of bread from the bakery, the way autumn leaves clung to wet pavement, the sound of laughter spilling from an open window. Slowly, my notebook stopped being a container for grief and became a map of growth. My husband noticed, too. One evening, as we cooked together, he paused while chopping onions. "You're smiling more," he said. I looked up, startled. "Am I?" "Yes," he said softly. "And not just with your mouth, with your eyes." That comment stayed with me. Smiling with my eyes, it meant the weight I carried wasn't crushing me anymore. But rebuilding wasn't just about routines. It was about facing the echoes. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still heard my father's voice. "You'll never be enough." I couldn't erase it, but I could answer it differently now. One afternoon, walking home from the store, I heard those words in my head. I stopped on the sidewalk, groceries heavy in my arms, and whispered out loud, "Maybe not for you, but I am enough for me." A passerby glanced at me strangely, but I didn't care. The words felt solid, like bricks laid down in the foundation I was building. I also began therapy. For years, I thought it was weakness, that talking to a stranger about my family meant I had failed to handle things alone. But sitting across from a therapist, I realized strength sometimes looks like surrendering the illusion of control. I told her everything, the wedding, the silence, the comparisons. She listened without flinching. At the end of one session, she said, "It sounds like you've been living in a house that never felt safe, but now you're building your own, brick by brick. What will you put in the walls?" I thought for a moment. Kindness, honesty, and the sound of laughter that doesn't need permission. She smiled. "That's a strong foundation." Her words echoed in me long after I left. I also began volunteering at a community center once a week. At first, it was small things, helping kids with homework, organizing shelves of donated clothes. But each act reminded me that value doesn't come from being approved by family. It comes from showing up. One girl, maybe 12 years old, hugged me after I helped her with an essay. "You explain things like you care," she said. Tears pricked my eyes because caring was something I thought I had to earn. Now, it was something I could simply give. At night, I sometimes walked through the apartment, touching the walls, the bookshelves, the photos of friends pinned on the fridge. Each detail felt like proof that I wasn't living in absence anymore. I was living in presence. One Saturday, I redecorated the living room. Nothing drastic, just new curtains, a plant in the corner, a rug with bright colors. When I finished, I sat back on the couch, staring at the room. It wasn't about the objects. It was about claiming space. For so long, I had lived like a guest in my own life. Now I was the host. The foundations I built weren't visible to the world. There was no applause, no dramatic reveal. But I felt them under my feet every day. In the confidence to speak, in the joy of writing, in the warmth of new connections. And maybe that's what healing looks like. Not fireworks, not closure wrapped neatly in bows, but steady construction. A life rebuilt, beam by beam, choice by choice. As I closed my journal one evening, I wrote in the margin, "This is the beginning, not the end." And for once, I believed it. I used to think belonging was something handed to you at birth, like a name or a last name etched on every form you signed. But after everything, I discovered belonging could be chosen. And that realization changed everything. It started small, with dinners. At first, they were simple gatherings. A few friends squeezed around my tiny dining table, mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors, plates stacked with pasta or takeout cartons spread open. The food was never the point. It was the laughter. The way someone leaned back, wiping tears of joy from their eyes because a story had sent them rolling. The way silence didn't feel heavy but comfortable, like a blanket we all shared. One night, as dishes piled in the sink, my friend Carla grabbed my hand. "You know this," she said, gesturing around the room. "This is family too." Her words lodged deep in me. For so long, family had been a wound, a hollow echo. But here, in this messy kitchen with glasses clinking and voices overlapping, I realized family could also be a balm. At work, I grew closer to a colleague named James. He had a way of checking in without prying, sliding a coffee across my desk with a simple, "Rough morning?" When I confessed once that I dreaded the holidays, he didn't look shocked. Instead, he said, "Then let's make our own traditions. Movies and takeout at my place this year?" I said yes, and it became a ritual. No pressure, no expectations, just connection. Even strangers sometimes stitched themselves into my chosen family. The barista who remembered my order, the neighbor who left cookies outside my door with a note that said, "For no reason at all." Each gesture reminded me that belonging wasn't about a shared past. It was about shared presence. Sundays turned into potlucks. Friends brought dishes from their childhoods, empanadas, lasagna, curry fragrant with spices. We'd sit cross-legged on the floor when chairs ran out, passing bowls and stories. One evening, someone asked me, "What's your comfort food?" I hesitated, the question slicing open old memories of dinners where comfort was the last thing I felt. But then I smiled. Honestly? This. Whatever we're eating, as long as it's together. The room erupted in cheers, forks clinking against plates, and I felt something inside me knit back together. There were hard days, too. Moments when grief returned sharp and unexpected. Once, I left a family gathering at a friend's house early because watching her father hug her too tightly reminded me of everything I'd lost. I cried all the way home, but when I arrived, my phone buzzed with messages. "Are you okay? Do you need me to come over?" The ache didn't disappear, but it softened. Because chosen family doesn't erase old wounds. It holds you steady while they heal. One particularly cold winter night, my husband and I invited friends over for board games. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the room glowed with warmth. At one point, as laughter roared and someone spilled hot chocolate on the rug, I looked around and thought, this is it. This is belonging. Not the perfect snapshots from glossy magazines, not the picture I once chased of my parents smiling at me proudly. Belonging was here, imperfect, messy, alive. The therapist once asked me, "How do you define family now?" I thought of Carla's hand in mine, of James with his easy coffee, of Sundays filled with overlapping voices. Family, I said slowly, is anyone who makes you feel like you don't have to earn your place? She nodded. And do you believe you deserve that kind of family? For the first time, I didn't hesitate. Yes. Belonging, I realized, wasn't about being chosen once, like an award you could lose if you messed up. It was about choosing every day to show up and to let others show up for you. That truth anchored me, and as I walked home one night beneath a canopy of stars, I whispered into the cold air, I belong. And I believed it legacy. It was a word I never thought belonged to me. Legacies were for people with grand names or fortunes, people whose portraits hung in gilded frames. But sitting at my desk one quiet evening, a cup of tea steaming beside my notebook, I realized we all leave legacies. Some are carved in marble, others are whispered in the way we make people feel. For so long, I carried the legacy of my parents' words, their dismissal, their comparisons, their absence. That was the inheritance I thought I couldn't escape. But now, as I traced my pen across the page, I saw a different story forming. My legacy wouldn't be the echoes of rejection. It would be the proof of resilience. I thought about the children at the community center, their eyes lighting up when I showed them a new way to solve a problem, or when I simply listened. Maybe they wouldn't remember my name years from now, but they would remember the feeling that someone believed in them, and maybe, just maybe, that belief would ripple outward, shaping choices they made long after I was gone. One evening, during another potluck, Carla asked me, "What do you want people to remember about you?" The question caught me mid-bite, fork hovering in the air. I laughed at first, trying to brush it off. But later that night, lying awake, her words circled back. What did I want to be remembered for? Not for surviving cruelty, but for choosing kindness anyway. Not for the family that left me behind, but for the one I built from courage and love. Looking forward didn't feel frightening anymore. It felt expansive, like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. I wanted to travel, to write more, maybe even publish the essays I had been hoarding in notebooks. I wanted to plant a garden, watch something grow under my care. I wanted to keep making Sundays sacred, filling them with laughter and light. And maybe, one day, I'd sit at a table with children of my own, or with nieces and nephews, or simply with the next generation of friends' kids climbing onto my lap. I wouldn't repeat the silence I grew up with. I'd say the words I once longed to hear. I'm proud of you. You matter. You belong here. The future wasn't about erasing the past. The scars would always be there. But scars are proof of healing, not signs of defeat. They tell the story of survival. On a chilly spring morning, I walked through the park, watching blossoms burst pink against bare branches. I realized that's what I wanted my life to be. Proof that beauty can grow where it was once barren. That belonging can bloom in unlikely soil. I whispered to myself, this is my legacy. Not the pain I inherited, but the love I choose to plant. And looking forward, I felt ready. Ready to build. Ready to love. Ready to belong without asking permission. Because the truest legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you live day after day, in the way you show up. And mine was just beginning.